There is a very specific feeling that happens when you realize the picture you've been looking at is not actually a window. It's a painting. And someone spent a long time making sure you never noticed the difference. That particular combination of disorientation and clarity arriving at exactly the same moment is what thousands of people in the 90-Day Fiancé community are experiencing right now. Because property records just entered the chat. And property records, unlike Instagram, do not have a filter setting. We have been inside Darcey Silva's world. We thought we understood it. The cameras showed us the aesthetic, the lifestyle, the visual communication of a woman who had arrived, and we accepted it. We built our understanding of her story on top of that visual. And now, through the most unglamorous form of documentation that exists, public county records, available to anyone with a browser and 20 minutes, that understanding is being quietly, methodically, permanently revised. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. And it starts with the one question nobody thought to ask out loud. If you are new here, welcome to the Tell-All Tapes, the channel that does not look away. If this video is giving you something, hit that like button right now, subscribe, and ring the notification bell because we cover the 90-day universe with a level of detail and honesty that you are genuinely not going to find anywhere else. The community built here asks the hard questions and follows them all the way to the answer. Now, let's get into it. To understand why this particular story is landing the way it's landing, you have to understand what Darcey Silva's brand actually is. Not what she says it is, not the words she uses to describe herself, the actual, functional, visual brand that she has built and maintained across years of television, social media, and public appearances. The Darcey Silva brand is aspirational. That is not an insult, that is a description of the strategy. The visual language of everything she puts out into the world communicates a very specific set of ideas. She is a woman who has been through difficulty and emerged elevated. She is a woman who has transformed the body, the face, the wardrobe, the environment, and that transformation is ongoing. Always ascending, always arriving at the next better version. The backdrop of her content communicates abundance. The aesthetic communicates a woman who has, by whatever combination of hustle and resilience and reinvention, built a life that looks like success. That is a choice, a deliberate, sustained, creative choice. And for a significant period of time, it worked extraordinarily well. The audience bought in, not just emotionally, literally. People buy what Darcey sells. They aspire to what she represents. They invest their loyalty and their attention and their money into the version of her that the visual presents. That is the aspirational contract. It is implicit, but it is real. And it is the specific contract that is now based on what public records are currently showing under serious documented strain. Here is where I want to slow down, because I think this point matters enormously, and I don't want it to get lost in the drama of everything else. The information that is currently circulating in the fan research community did not come from a hacker. It did not come from a disgruntled ex-partner with an axe to grind. It did not come from a tabloid source with unknown motivations. It came from county assessor databases, from property records, from the kind of official documentation that exists in the public domain specifically because transparency in property ownership is a foundational feature of how real estate law works in this country. The people who found this information are not doing anything illegal or even remotely controversial. They are doing what any member of the public has the legal right to do, looking up publicly available government records. And what those records are showing is creating a conversation that cannot be easily dismissed, redirected, or cried away. Let's talk about what property records actually contain, because I think a lot of people's eyes glaze over when you say county assessor database. And that instinct is exactly what makes this kind of documentation so powerful as a truth-telling mechanism. Property records document who owns what. They record the assessed value of properties, which is the government's official determination of what a piece of real estate is worth for taxation purposes. They record transaction histories: when a property was bought, when it was sold, what it sold for. They record mortgage information. They record whether taxes are current or delinquent. They are, in the most literal sense possible, a paper trail of someone's real relationship with real property. They are not subject to the normal defenses that public figures use when faced with uncomfortable information. You cannot argue with a county assessor's database about your feelings. You cannot tell a property record that it is misrepresenting your journey. You cannot pivot to your daughters when someone is asking about square footage and ownership status. Property records have no emotional intelligence. They have no interest in your brand. They simply document what is, accurately, without commentary, waiting patiently for someone to look. Someone looked. And what they found, and I am going to be careful and precise here because precision is what this story demands, is a significant documented gap between the life that Darcey Silva's content consistently implies and the life that official records document. I want to say that again because I think it is the sentence that matters most in this entire conversation. There is a significant documented gap between the visual impression her content creates and what the paperwork says. Now, let me tell you why that gap is more important than it might initially seem. Lifestyle brands operate on trust. Not trust in the abstract, warm, emotional sense, trust in the transactional sense. When you build a brand around a specific image of your life, your audience extends credit to that image. They believe the representation. They make decisions about who to follow, what to buy, which aspirations to hold, which version of success to aim for based on the representation. The representation is the product. And the product, it turns out, may have been significantly misrepresented. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of thing that in other industries comes with legal vocabulary attached to it. But here's where this story gets genuinely complicated, and this is the part where I want you to really pay attention, because this is where it stops being simple and starts being interesting. Darcey Silva does not appear to lie the way that calculated, strategic people lie. She does not appear to be someone who sat down with a spreadsheet and a 5-year plan and said, I am going to construct a false reality and maintain it with precision. That is not what the behavioral pattern suggests. And I think understanding what the behavioral pattern actually suggests is more illuminating than simply calling her a liar and moving on. What Darcey appears to do consistently, instinctively, with what seems like genuine conviction, is inhabit the aspirational version of her life as if it is the current version of her life. She lives in the future tense and presents it as the present tense. Think about what that means for a moment. The home that communicates abundance is not the home she necessarily has. It is the home she intends to have. The life that the aesthetic promises is not the life she is currently living. It is the life she is moving toward. The transformation narrative is not complete. It is in progress. But the content presents it as arrived, as achieved, as real, now, today. Look at this kitchen. Look at this lighting. Look at this life. That is a very specific psychological orientation. It is not a calculation. It is closer to magical thinking. The genuine belief that if you present the destination confidently enough, the destination becomes real. The aspiration and the reality blur, and the content you create lives in that blur. And for a long time, the audience lives there with you. Until property records arrive and say, actually, let's talk about the present tense. Because the present tense has documentation. Here is the specific detail that the research community has identified as the center of this story, and I want to walk through it carefully because the details matter. The property associated with Darcey's public persona, the one that has appeared in the background of her content, the one whose aesthetic has been discussed and admired within the fan community, the one that has contributed significantly to the visual construction of the Darcey Silva brand, has a documented ownership and financial history that does not align with the impression the content creates. Additionally, a separate address connected to Darcey through public records reveals a living situation that is, and I am choosing my words with deliberate care here, considerably more modest than the visual brand suggests. The gap between those two things is not trivial. It is not the kind of gap that can be explained by, oh, I was renting at the time, or that was a temporary situation. It is the kind of gap that requires active, sustained, deliberate effort to maintain. It requires making choices consistently over time about what to show and what not to show, which means the curation was intentional, which means the gap was known, and that changes the nature of the conversation entirely. Because there is a meaningful difference between someone whose public image doesn't perfectly reflect their private reality, which describes essentially every person who has ever existed, and someone who has actively, consistently constructed a public image that is materially, documentably disconnected from their documented circumstances. One is human, the other is a strategy. Now, I want to address something directly because I have seen this conversation happening in comments and in fan forums, and I think it deserves a straight answer. Some people are saying, so what? She is allowed to present herself however she wants. She is allowed to aspire to a lifestyle and communicate that aspiration. Who is it hurting? That is a legitimate question, and I want to take it seriously. Here is the answer. It is hurting the people who made financial decisions, emotional decisions, decisions about their own self-worth and their own aspirations based on representation. The person who bought the product Darcey was selling because they believed in the version of success she was demonstrating. The person who measured their own life against the lifestyle she was presenting and found themselves lacking without knowing the lifestyle itself was a projection. We are influenced by what we see. We make decisions based on what we believe to be real. When what we believe to be real is deliberately constructed to mislead, those decisions are made on false information. That is not a small thing. That is, in the most fundamental sense, a breach of the implicit agreement between a public figure and the audience that watches them. But here is the part of this story that I find genuinely, unexpectedly moving. And I say this as someone who has spent considerable time in this community documenting the patterns and the contradictions and the behavioral loops. I think Darcey Silva believes in herself with a ferocity that is almost painful to watch. I think she has survived things that would have ended most people, and she has kept going with a determination that is legitimately impressive. I think the aspirational version of her life is not a cynical construction. I think it is a genuine vision, a real destination, a future she believes in with everything she has. The problem is that vision requires the present to be different from what the documents say it is, and you cannot maintain that gap indefinitely. Eventually, the present tense catches up, and here we are. Let me tell you what happens now. Not in terms of specific predictions, because this community has learned that Darcey is genuinely unpredictable and consistently survives things that appear unsurvivable. But in terms of the structural dynamics of a situation like this, the standard Darcey crisis response toolkit includes emotional vulnerability deployed at high volume, the journey narrative, references to her daughters as anchors of authenticity, and a pivot away from the specific topic toward the broader theme of her resilience. These are all tools that work extremely well in emotional contexts. They work because they are not entirely the vulnerability is real, the love for her daughters is real, the resilience is real. The tools work because they are built from genuine materials. But those tools have no application to a county assessor's database. You cannot cry about a property record. You cannot pivot to your growth when someone is asking about assessed values and ownership history. The emotional apparatus that has dissolved every previous crisis, and it has dissolved some genuinely serious ones, has no purchase on a spreadsheet, no traction on official documentation. This is structurally new terrain. Watch for what happens next. Watch for the response that does not engage with the specific information at all, that changes the subject so completely, so emotionally, so loudly, that by the time it is over, people have forgotten what the original question was. That is the only available move. And it is, for the first time in a long time, going to be genuinely difficult to execute, because the audience has seen this before. The audience has been through this cycle enough times that a significant portion of them have developed immunity to the pivot. They know what a pivot looks like. They know what changing the subject with tears looks like. They have, as this channel and others have documented extensively, receipts. And those receipts are getting organized. Let me tell you about the receipts, because this is where the story goes from interesting to genuinely significant. The fan research community that produced this property record analysis is not a fringe group. It is not a hate account. It is a community of people, many of them professionals in fields like finance, real estate, law, accounting, who have been watching this show for years and who apply their actual expertise to what they observe. The person who knows county assessor websites because they work in property management. The person who recognizes financial red flags because they work in lending. The person who understands corporate structure because they run a business. These people have been watching, noting, cross-referencing, and building a body of evidence that is, frankly, remarkable in its depth and precision. And what they have produced, in this case, is not speculation. It is not a rumor. It is not someone's guess about someone's life based on a vibe they got from a reality TV episode. It is documented, it is sourced, it is a public record, and it is now out in the world in a way that cannot be recalled. That is the point of no return I want to end this section on. County assessor websites do not take down entries because a reality TV personality is having a difficult week. The information is indexed, it is searchable, it will be available to anyone who looks for it for as long as those databases exist, which is to say, effectively, forever. The narrative of the Darcey Silva life, the abundant, thriving, arrived and ascending version, now has a footnote in a government database. And footnotes, as we have established in this series across 15 episodes, have a tendency to quietly, persistently become the most important part of the story. The question is not whether Darcey recovers from this. She has recovered from things that should have ended her public life. She will probably recover from this. Her resilience is, in its way, genuinely extraordinary. The question is what the recovery looks like, because every previous recovery was built on performance, on the visual, on the presentation of a version of herself that the audience was invited to believe in. And the audience slowly, finally, with official documents in their hands, is learning to look past the presentation and ask what the paperwork says. That is part one. Part two is where we go into what the specific findings mean for Darcey's relationships with her audience, with her brand partners, and with the people in her personal life who showed up for the version of her that the content presented. And that conversation is darker and more specific and more honest than anything we have covered so far. Subscribe if you are not already here. Like this video so the algorithm understands that this community wants these conversations. The second part will start now. This is the part about what happens to a person when the gap between who they are presenting and who the documents say they are finally becomes impossible to manage alone. Let's go. There is a concept in behavioral psychology called identity foreclosure. It describes what happens when a person becomes so completely committed to a particular version of themselves, a particular narrative, a particular image, a particular story about who they are and where they are going, that they lose the ability to update that story when reality contradicts it. The identity becomes load-bearing. You cannot remove it without the whole structure coming down. So instead of updating, you defend, you perform, you double down on the presentation because the presentation is the only architecture holding everything together. I am not diagnosing anyone. I want to be clear about that. But I am saying that the behavioral pattern we have documented across 15 episodes of this series, the specific way that Darcey Silva responds to contradiction, to challenge, to evidence that the version she is presenting does not match the version that exists in the world, fits that framework with a precision that is hard to ignore. Every time reality has pushed back, the response has been more presentation, more aesthetic, more visual confirmation of the version she needs the world to see. The turkey chapter, the fashion line, the television spinoff, the surgeries that communicate transformation even when the internal architecture has not shifted. Each contradiction met not with revision, but with escalation. And now the escalation has run into something it cannot escalate past. Property records do not care how committed you are to a narrative. They do not respond to volume or tears or the kind of emotional intensity that has historically managed to redirect every difficult conversation Darcey has ever faced on camera. They are just there, accurate, patient, available. And the audience that has been watching this pattern for years is finally and collectively connecting the dots in a way that is different from anything that has come before. Because this time, the dots are not feelings or impressions or readings of body language and reaction. The dots are official documents. And official documents connect in straight lines. Let me tell you what is specifically changing in the audience relationship, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most for understanding where this goes from here. For a long time, and I mean years, multiple seasons, an enormous amount of content, the Darcey Silva fan community operated in a state that I would describe as affectionate skepticism. People knew. On some level, the audience always knew that the presentation was curated. They knew that the version on screen was the version being offered, not necessarily the version that existed behind the camera. They knew this, and they watched anyway, because the entertainment value of the gap between presentation and reality is, honestly, enormous. That gap is the engine of the entire 90-day franchise. The gap is the show. But affectionate skepticism is a specific and fragile emotional state. It requires that the gap stay within certain limits. It requires that the fiction remain comfortable enough that the audience can enjoy it without feeling implicated in it. The moment the gap becomes documented, the moment it stops being a vibe and starts being a verified, sourced, officially recorded discrepancy, the affectionate part of the skepticism starts to fall away. What is left is just skepticism. And skepticism without affection is a fundamentally different relationship between an audience and a public figure. It is not warm. It does not extend the benefit of the doubt. It does not absorb new information charitably. It looks at every new piece of content and asks, what is this covering for? What is the performance designed to distract me from? What is the new information being managed? That shift, once it happens in a community, is extremely difficult to reverse, because trust, once it starts breaking in the direction of documented evidence rather than feeling, does not rebuild on feelings. It only rebuilds on documentation, on receipts of a different kind, on verifiable, sourced, official confirmation that what you are being shown is what actually is. And Darcey Silva has not, in her public career, operated in a mode that produces that kind of documentation. She produces emotion. She produces aesthetics. She produces the visual language of transformation and resilience and arrival. She is genuinely gifted at all of those things. They are real skills. They have sustained a public career longer than most people who started in the same space. But they are not the skills that rebuild trust in a post-documentation moment. And the post-documentation moment is where we are now. Here's the relationship piece that I think is being underestimated in the current conversation, and this is the part I promised you in part 1, the part that is darker than the property records themselves. The lifestyle that Darcey has constructed and projected is not just a brand strategy. It is, functionally, a filter. It determines who shows up in her life. The aesthetic communicates a specific income bracket, a specific social world, a specific kind of network, and it attracts people who want proximity to that world. Partners who are drawn to the image, collaborators who are drawn to the brand, friendships that are built around the version she presents. When the foundation of that image is publicly questioned, when official records suggest the reality behind the aesthetic is significantly different from the aesthetic itself, those relationships become structurally unstable, because they were built on the brand, not the person. And the people who showed up for the brand are not necessarily the people who stay for the reality. Think about what that means for Darcey specifically. She has spoken, across many episodes of television and many hours of content, about wanting genuine connection, real love, a relationship that sees her and accepts her and stays. That desire, I think, is entirely authentic. I think it is one of the most real things about her public persona. The longing for genuine connection is not performed. It is visible in every relationship she has entered, in the specific way she overcommits and overpresents and mistakes intensity for intimacy. But here is the cruel structural irony of a brand-first life. The more aggressively you curate your image, the more you attract people who are drawn to the image and filter out the people who might connect with what is underneath it. The presentation that builds the audience also builds the barrier. The curation that creates the brand also creates the distance between the brand and genuine connection. Every partner who was drawn to the Darcey Silva visual, the abundance, the transformation narrative, the arriving woman, was drawn to something that the documents suggest is at least partially a construction, which means the foundation of those relationships was at least partially constructed, which means they were always more fragile than they looked, which means the pattern of intense beginnings and painful endings is not bad luck or bad choices in partners alone. It is, at least in part, the structural consequence of leading with a version of yourself that the paperwork does not fully support. I am not saying this to be cruel. I am saying it because I think it is genuinely important and genuinely underreported in the conversation about Darcey Silva. The property record story is not just a financial story. It is a relationship story. It is a lonely story. It is a story about what happens when the gap between who you are presenting and who you actually are becomes so wide that the people who love you are in some meaningful sense loving someone who doesn't fully exist. That is a devastating place to be. And I think underneath the performance and the aesthetic and the aspirational presentation, there is a person who knows it. Now, let me talk about what happens to the brand from a practical standpoint, because this is also part of the story and it deserves honest analysis. The commercial dimension of Darcey Silva's public presence, the partnerships, the product lines, the sponsored content, the business ventures, all of it depends on what marketers call authentic reach. The idea that the audience genuinely believes in the person they are following, that the endorsement means something because the relationship between the influencer and the audience is real. When that relationship is disrupted by documented evidence that the foundational image is significantly misrepresented, the commercial value of the reach drops. Not immediately. These things move slowly in practice, but structurally, the damage is real. Because brand partners do due diligence, because their legal teams read things, because the risk calculation for associating a product with someone whose public image is under active, documented scrutiny is different from the risk calculation when everything is stable. Darcey has built business ventures around the aspirational brand, the fashion, the beauty, the lifestyle adjacency. All of it is downstream of the core image of the abundant, thriving, transformed woman. When that core image is challenged at the documentary level, everything downstream is affected. The brand partners get nervous, the collaborators get cautious, the commercial ecosystem built on the image starts to feel the tremors from the foundation. And here is the thing about that commercial ecosystem that I think is particularly important right now. Darcey is not young in the influencer timeline. She has been in this public space long enough that rebuilding a brand from a fundamentally different foundation, from honesty rather than aspiration, from documented reality rather than projected image, would require a kind of reinvention that is genuinely difficult and genuinely rare. Most public figures who reach this moment do not successfully reinvent. They either double down on the performance and hope the audience forgets, or they quietly fade from the spaces where the contradiction is most visible. The third option, honest reinvention, genuine reconstruction of a public image based on reality rather than aspiration, exists, but it requires something that goes against every instinct that has been built and reinforced over years of a very particular kind of public life. It requires showing the version, the actual house, the actual numbers, the actual circumstances without the aesthetic overlay. It requires, in the most specific sense, letting the paperwork be the content. And that is a terrifying prospect for someone who has spent years making sure the paperwork was never the content. But here is what I genuinely believe, and I want to say this clearly because I think this channel has an obligation to be honest about the full picture and not just the damaging parts. The version of Darcey Silva that the documents are pointing toward, the real one, the one behind the carefully maintained aesthetic gap, is interesting. It is complicated, is in some ways more compelling than the aspirational version, because the real version has actually survived things, has actually kept going through failure and heartbreak and public humiliation on a scale that most people will never experience, has actually rebuilt multiple times from genuinely difficult circumstances. That person, the one who is living in the gap between the aspiration and the documentation, does not need the filter, does not need the curated kitchen and the lifestyle aesthetic and the visual vocabulary of abundance, because the real story is already remarkable. It just happens to be less photogenic than the version being presented. The audience that would show up for that version, the honest version, the documented version, the version where the aspiration is clearly labeled as aspiration rather than presented as current reality, is a different audience from the one currently watching, but it might be a more durable one, a more genuinely connected one, the kind of audience that stays not because the image is aspirational, but because the person is real. That audience exists. It is waiting, and the path to it runs directly through the property records, through the acknowledgement that the gap exists, that it was known, and that the time for maintaining it has passed. I do not know if Darcey Silva will take that path. Based on everything this community has documented over 15 episodes of this series, the probability of a pivot toward radical honesty rather than escalated performance is not high. The patterns are deeply established. The instincts run deep. The emotional toolkit that has always reached for presentation rather than documentation is not easily retrained. But I have been wrong before about what people in this space are capable of. And I think at this moment, this specific convergence of documented evidence, an increasingly skeptical audience, and a commercial ecosystem that is beginning to ask questions is the kind of pressure that occasionally produces genuinely unexpected results. The pressure is real. The documentation is real. The audience shift is real. What Darcey does with that combination of realities is the next chapter of this story. And this channel will be here for every part of it. Here is my final thought on this, and it is the thought I want to leave you with because I think it is the one that matters most after everything we have covered across this episode and across this series. The reason the story resonates is the reason property records about a reality TV personality are generating this level of conversation and this level of genuine emotional response is not because people enjoy watching someone struggle. The audience that cares about this story is not primarily motivated by cruelty. They are motivated by recognition. because the gap between who we are presenting and who we actually are is not unique to Darcey Silva. It is not unique to reality television. It is the defining anxiety of a public life lived through social media. The constant management of the distance between the version offered to the world and the version that exists when the camera is off and the filter is down and the county assessor's database is just sitting there, accurate, waiting. We watch Darcey because she is an extreme version of something we all do. We curate, we present, we live slightly ahead of ourselves and offer the destination as if it is the current location. We just do it at a smaller scale, with lower stakes and without public records that can be cross-referenced by people with professional expertise in property valuation. The difference between Darcey Silva and most of us is not the behavior. It is the scale and the documentation. And when the documentation arrives for any of us at any scale, the question is always the same. Do you defend the gap or do you close it? Every recovery she has ever made was built on defending the gap, on presenting a better, more elevated, more transformed version that made the previous version irrelevant. And it worked multiple times because she is genuinely skilled at it. But the gap has a public record now. And a public record is not a version of events that can be superseded by a better presentation. It is a fixed point. It exists outside of the narrative. It does not update when the content updates. The only thing that resolves a documented gap is documented honesty, is showing verifiably that the reality and the presentation are moving toward each other rather than further apart, is letting the audience see not just the destination, but the actual current location. That is a hard thing to do. It may be the hardest thing that the specific kind of public life Darcey Silva has built could ask of her, but it is the only path that does not end with the footnote becoming the headline. We will be watching. We will be documenting. And as always on this channel, we will keep looking until we find what is actually there, not just what we were meant to see. If this episode gave you something, if it made you think, made you question, gave you a framework for understanding what you have been watching, please like this video right now. It genuinely matters for this channel's ability to keep doing this work. Subscribe if you are not already part of this community, because we are just getting started and the stories we have coming are bigger and more documented than anything we have covered so far. Share this video with someone in the 90-day community who you know is asking these same questions, because the conversation is better when more people are in it. The tell-all tapes does not look away. We follow the evidence, we do the work, and we will be here every time the paperwork says something the content does not. Thank you for reading. We will see you in the next one.